India's Minister of External Affairs, Dr. S. Jaishankar, has just returned from a visit to Germany. In Germany, he said that Russia and Ukraine need to negotiate off the battlefield, and India is willing to play a role in this entire exercise. The National Security Advisor of India, Ajit Doval, has been in Russia as well for the BRICS NSA meeting. And on the sidelines of the BRICS, NSA Ajit Doval also held a bilateral meeting with the Secretary of the Security Council of the Russian Federation. According to sources, NSA Ajit Doval is carrying India's peace plan and the peace proposal by Prime Minister Narendra Modi that will be shared with President Vladimir Putin. Both Russian and the Ukrainian presidents, along with other countries like Italy and USA, all have talked about how India can act as a mediator between the two warring nations. So could India play a critical role in bringing peace in the region? Joining me to discuss this is Dr. Arvind Gupta, former Deputy NSA and Director of Vivekananda Foundation. We also have Shairi Malhotra, Associate Fellow of the Observer Research Foundation, and Dr. Sriparna Pathak, Associate Professor of International Politics in OP Jindal Global University. Dr. Pathak, may I begin with you to understand what's been really happening? And if I can, try to understand that what are these key principles and objectives of India's peace plan? Because not many people really understand beyond the point what Prime Minister has said till now, or Dr. Jaishankar has, that solutions cannot be found in the battlefield. We need to negotiate. We need to have a diplomacy. What do you think would be, India-centric, or perhaps a peace plan that is in India's interest also?
Yeah. So, how would it be different? Because recently, Russia has stated that it is willing to have three countries in particular which could play an important role. One is, of course, India. The other two are China and Russia. Now, India's peace proposal would not be something which was like China's proposal peace plan, which was broadly outlined in 12 points. But that is something which the West would not agree to, because the word war was not even mentioned in the document, nor does the document even condemn Russian aggression. That has been a bit different. Despite the long-term friendship between India and Russia, when Prime Minister Modi did go to Russia, and he did speak to President Putin, he did mention that hearts bleed when children get killed and those sorts of things. So India's approach is going to be more objective than what has been China's. Would the West really be open to such a thing is another interesting question.
Yes.
As of today morning, Iran has said that it's going to back any proposal which is going to be put forth by China and Brazil, the two of the three countries which Russia had talked about. India is not over there. Now, if Iran is also going to throw its weight behind China and Brazil, that's another point which the West would not really agree to. China's plan also, it's not going to agree to, because there was a NATO discussion earlier this year in June, in which there was a condemnation of China and as to how it keeps egging Russia on through myriads of arms supplies, diplomatic support, and so on. So now India's stance has to be different from that. Now, Dr. Jaishankar has mentioned 4 principles when he was in Berlin. It's a time of peace. There can be no solutions to war on the ground. Russia has to be at the table, and that India is concerned and engaged. Ajit Doval also held talks with his Russian counterpart about 3 to 4 hours ago. So whatever the finer points, they would come out, but they're going to be different from what China's has been so far, and it's going to be more objective.
Fair enough. Dr. Arvind Gupta is also with us, but if I can quickly go to Shairi at this point in time. Shairi, you've been tracking Europe for a very long time. What does the West really want? We've heard statements from the Italian Prime Minister, the Polish Prime Minister, positive towards India's peace plan, positive towards India's role in building peace in the region. And of course, Dr. Jaishankar has said that without Russia on the table, there cannot really be any kind of a forward movement. How do you think that India can play a critical role, and will that be acceptable to Europe, to the West, which has been backing Ukraine?
Thanks, Aditya, for having me on the program. Let me just first say that, there was some backlash from the West when Prime Minister Modi visited Russia in July. But then he visited Ukraine when it was Ukraine's Independence Day. And this did send out a strong signal of Indian support for Ukraine's sovereignty. So I think both these trips, Russia and Ukraine, enabled India to have conversations about the war with both Putin and Zelensky, and also allowed India to have a better understanding of the positions of the countries involved. Now, of course, bringing everybody to the negotiating table is important for India. It's now going to be 3 years almost since the war began.
Right.
It's also because the likelihood that an outcome would be reached on the battlefield seems slim. India's position on the war has been consistent. It's been to call for dialogue and diplomacy, advocate for peace. I think having said this, even while mediation or negotiation is very important, I'm not sure if currently the timing is so ripe since both parties have not yet arrived at a point of exhaustion in the war yet. Just a few weeks ago, we saw Ukraine's offensive into Russia's Kursk region. And this seems to have somewhat tipped the balance of the situation. So actually, in one way, the conflict is intensifying. There are, of course, a multitude of powerful players involved in this war. You mentioned the West. So you have the US, you have the European Union, you have EU member states, you have NATO. The EU, even at this juncture, is still engaged in a rhetoric of supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, even though there are signs of support weakening under the surface. You also have the US elections approaching soon, and the outcome of those elections can change the dynamics of this war. I think, though, as far as the West is concerned, India probably is a relatively impartial bystander because it has the trust of both the sides.
Yes.
Unlike in countries like China that are actually aiding Russia's war effort by supplying dual-use tech. You would recall that just before Russia initiated this war, it had signed a no-limits partnership with China. So in terms of West's eyes, I think India would be seen as a more credible interlocutor compared to a country like China. India has been in regular contact with all the parties involved, Russia, Ukraine, but also the West, with whom India's ties have dramatically strengthened in recent years. Unlike China, whose relations with the West are under tremendous strain at the moment. With the United States, of course, there is the US-China great power strategic competition happening, but even the EU and European countries are currently trying to recalibrate their ties with China.
Fair
So
enough.
in a way, I think India is better positioned to play the role of a bridging power through its active diplomacy and engagement with both sides.
All right, India can be a credible interlocutor. Dr. Arvind Gupta, thank you for joining us. So good to see you after a very long time, sir. I want to understand from you, how does India plan to leverage its relationships both with Russia and Ukraine to build this kind of a consensus on a ceasefire, or at least to begin with some kind of a negotiation? Can India really play a very pragmatic and a realistic role in this?
I think we have to be cautious and temper our expectations. Certainly, India has had conversations with Russia and with Ukraine, and perhaps there is some thinking in Europe also that India can play a role. But before we go to exactly what could be a peace plan and what are India's suggestions, etc., I think we have to understand that the war is going on. And frankly, I haven't heard on either side that they are really interested in peace at this moment.
Right.
Ukraine has now occupied some territories in Kursk, and they feel that this can be a bargaining point. The Russians have been taken by surprise, and they want Ukraine to be out of those territories. And frankly, at this time, neither side is exhausted. They don't see us, give any indication of having been exhausted. In fact, more and more weapons are coming to Ukraine. They are asking for weapons and which can strike deep into Russia. The Russians feel that this is a war of attrition which they can win. So I don't see any deep desire on either side for a peace. So who is talking about peace today except for people who are not involved in the conflict?
Yes.
So I think as the previous panelist said, that these conversations would help us understand the situation better, and then perhaps have a more realistic understanding of the dynamic of the situation before we talk about any credible peace plan from anywhere, for that matter.
For a very long time, sir, we've seen a lot of lecturing towards India, if I may say so, from Europe and the West over the last 2 years, and we have taken a very independent stance. Do you think that this is going to end up again? It's been more than 2.5 years already, a long war, an endless war, until an exhaustion or a fatigue really sets in and forces into some kind of a negotiation or diplomacy to take place. How would the ending really happen? Could there be some, buying of time until the US elections really end, perhaps towards the early next year?
Well, I don't see there is any end in sight, and certainly not before the US elections. So this war is going to continue as it has for the last 2.5+ years. I think we'll have to live with that. There doesn't seem to be any particular trigger which will lead to the end of the war at this moment. Before the Kursk, thrust, Ukraine seemed to be exhausting at that one point of time. But I think that has now changed when Prime Minister Modi met Zelensky. Zelensky was already on a high, and since then he has asked for more and more weapons. In fact, he told the Indian Prime Minister that yes, India can play a role, should have played a role, but you first join our first, the joint statement that was issued in the first meeting, the international conference which was held without Russia. And I think rightly so, India has said that without Russia, how can there be any negotiation or peace plan, etc. And the other point I want to say is if the West or Ukraine is interested in peace, there is no dearth of interlocutors. They have enough experience of talking amongst themselves for a very long time.
Yeah.
They know the issue very well. They were part of the Minsk process, etc. And there could be any number of interlocutors who could hold a meeting, etc. So I don't think it is one country which can play a role. Even China probably cannot play that role. It's only when the war dynamics change in such a way that one side seems exhausted and is ready, then only I think the talk of negotiations, ceasefire, etc. can happen.
Fair enough. Shriparna, from the very beginning of the war, we've seen a lot of comments, particularly from Europe and the West, about India's independent stance. India has, of course, fiercely defended it and said that this is a part of our national interest, a part of our strategic autonomy, and we will, of course, explore that. If the Americans can do that, if the West can do that, so can India. Do you think there is a larger understanding now of India's positioning, ever since the consensus at the G20 or the other multilaterals that have happened since? Or do you think it will still take time for the West particularly to understand India's position, and of course emphasis also on the global South?
So for the West, the approach will never really change with regards to India, no matter however much tilting there might be shown in terms of trade, in terms of scientific cooperation, etc. But the fact remains that international politics has been dominated by the Anglo-Saxon world. India, of course, wants to find its own space as well, and India has very strongly defended its stance. Dr. Jaishankar, on multiple accounts, has called out European hypocrisy when they've talked about India's oil imports, energy imports, and so on. But the fact still remains that despite them knowing how much they would be importing, how much oil or energy they would be importing, they still decided to go and point a finger at India. This is just one instance. Why would any country do that? That only happens when there's a sense of superiority. Now, with all these new sort of formulations coming in, G20, etc., and that China has been seen as a bigger threat, there is a need to look at another important player, a player which is not China, a player which has, well, a very big market, which can, through which, Western countries can think of decoupling or moving away from the reliance on China, etc. So India becomes a very lucrative option. But does that really mean there's going to be any sort of equal respect? I don't really think so. But yes, this is a good opportunity, at least for India, to showcase that it has an independent voice. That's why Prime Minister Modi went both to Russia and to Ukraine. And we've constantly been talking about our forms of how we see peace. When we did say in those 4 points, when Dr. Jaishankar mentioned those 4 principles, time of peace, there would be no solutions to war, Russia has to be at the table, and so on. When that point was made, Russia has to be at the table. It was made very clear that, this constant hankering for war, which we see, not just from the West, but, NATO allies, etc., and other allies of the Western countries, that is not what we want. If you really want some sort of peace, you will have to have Russia on the table. So this is in very twisted ways, a good opportunity for India to also showcase as to how it's very different from the Western approach as well as from the Chinese approach.
Finally, Shairi, to you, the Ukrainian envoy has said that India should play a larger role in convincing Putin to come on the dialogue table. Do you think over the next 6 months, because of course we have the US elections, there could be more build-up in the sense of Zelensky perhaps visiting India, Putin as well visiting India, and some kind of parallel back-channel dialogues also happening between the two countries with New Delhi? Because at the beginning of the war, we saw Lavrov and of course Antony Blinken coming to New Delhi, not meeting, but they were at the ORF event where you work, and also parallelly meeting their counterpart in New Delhi. Thereafter, last year we saw the G20 also happening, some kind of a consensus there. Do you see this kind of a diplomatic build-up by New Delhi over the next 6 months?
I think so. Yes, Aditya, I do. And in fact, this has been happening a lot. We have been having back channel discussions with all the parties involved, with the Europeans as well. But again, I think effective mediation, when you talk about that, I think that's only possible if both the sides want this, as Mr. Gupta mentioned. Both sides need to be committed to a peace initiative being the way out of this war, which at the conflict's current juncture of escalation, I think appears unlikely. But I think India can continue to play a proactive role by again continuously emphasizing its willingness to play peacemaker should it be called upon to do so, and
Right.
it can continue engaging with all sides, something that it has been doing. And I think when the time comes when there is a point of exhaustion, I think all of this goodwill that India has built up over the course of these last 2.5-3 years could be of help in negotiations.
Well, this is something different about India's diplomacy. We are not imposing ourselves. We are not trying to impose our policy between these two countries or any axis against the other. Dr. Gupta, what I want to understand from you is that the Indian NSA, Mr. Ajit Doval, is currently in Moscow. He's met his counterpart already a few hours ago. And of course, there are speculations about a peace plan, of course, that he's presented to Putin, much being discussed. But what would be this peace plan? Of course, you said that beyond the peace plan, we need to first arrive at that stage. But what could be that peace plan really? And how significant is NSA's visit currently in this kind of a backdrop to Russia?
This visit is very significant. It's taking place after visits to Russia and also to Ukraine. So it will be a chance for them to talk about these visits and apprise each other. And then, of course, there is the BRICS summit, which is going to happen in October.
Yes.
I'm sure that is also being discussed. So there could be some discussion about these issues and other issues. So when NSA goes to these places, it's a very comprehensive discussion that happens. And these discussions should continue to happen. And I think we would see a lot of discussion going forward on India's participation in BRICS and BRICS issues. So that is one issue. As far as Ukraine is concerned, as I said, I don't think there is going to be any peace plan apart from what has been said in those 4 points. The peace plan can only happen once you understand the positions of each other, both sides well. And for all you know, there could be more contacts going forward, both with Russia and with Ukraine and maybe with other countries, if there is any indication that this can move. But right now, I don't think it's too early to talk about an Indian peace plan.
Well, of course, too early to speak about an Indian peace plan, but Ajit Doval is in Russia. Of course, Dr. Jaishankar has been in Germany. We'll have to wait and watch how things unfold. But New Delhi has made it clear that solutions cannot be found on the battlefield. And perhaps this is time to get on to diplomacy and bring both sides on a common table for a long-lasting solution. Thank you very much to Dr. Arvind Gupta, Sriparna Pathak and Shairi.